Our reading is from Tim O'Brien's powerful book, The Things They Carried, a collection of short stories that came out of his time as a soldier in Vietnam. On the Rainy River tells the story of a young man who has been drafted and has traveled north to enter Canada and avoid fighting in a war in which he does not believe. This passage takes place in a boat on the Rainy River between Minnesota and Canada. O'Brien writes, "Everywhere it seemed, in the trees and water and sky, a great worldwide sadness came pressing down on me, a crushing sorrow like I had never known it before. And what was so sad, I realized, was that Canada had become a pitiful fantasy, silly and hopeless. It was no longer a possibility. Right then, with a shore so close, I understood that I would not do what I should do. I would not swim away from my hometown and my country and my life. I would not be brave. That old image of myself as a hero, as a man of conscience and courage, all that was just a threadbare pipe dream. Bobbing there on the Rainy River, looking back at the Minnesota shore, I felt a sudden swell of helplessness come over me, a drowning sensation, as if I had toppled overboard and was being swept away by the silver waves. The little aluminum boat rocked softly beneath me. There was the wind and the sky. I tried to will myself overboard. I gripped the edge of the boat and leaned forward and thought, now. I did try. It just wasn't possible. All those eyes on me, the town, the whole universe, and I couldn't risk the embarrassment. It was as if there were an audience to my life, that swirl of faces along the river, and in my head, I could hear people screaming at me. Traitor, they yelled, turncoat, pussy. I felt myself blush. I couldn't tolerate it. I couldn't endure the mockery or the disgrace or the patriotic ridicule. Even in my imagination, the shore just 20 yards away, I couldn't make myself be brave. It had nothing to do with morality, embarrassment, that's all it was. And right there I submitted. I would go to the war. I would kill and maybe die because I was embarrassed not to. The stories of soldiers and their loved ones are some of the best ways we have to understand the realities of war and its consequences. Yet, how many stories like Natalie's and Dan's and Tim's have not been told? We see the weight of untold veteran stories in rampant PTSD and suicides, and in many veteran struggles with broken families, addiction, and homelessness. It's not too difficult for us to see now, 107 years after the war to end wars, how complex war and its fruits really are. Beyond the lives lost and ecological destruction, obliterated cities and dreams, war interrupts the trajectory of lives and damages our ability to envision peaceful ways of working together. We can see clearly in places like the Middle East how collective trauma both arises from and contributes to cyclical violence. We can see that stopping a war or signing a treaty is only the beginning. The real work is repairing harm, rebuilding, telling new stories. The work of Thomas Hubel and others in recognizing the patterns and complexity of collective trauma can help us think about healing from a new angle. We can realize that peace will not come from better weapons, but from better stories, truer stories about the cost of war and our complicity in its continuance. So a few of my own stories. Like Tim O'Brien, I was brought up to believe that the United States was the best country on the planet. We were in charge of protecting democracy, and our incursions into other countries were for their own good. I was a teen during the Vietnam War, and later had partners and friends who were both soldiers and peace activists. I began to understand the deep cost to others of continuing war as a tool for change. As a young person, I worked for 3 years in Northern Ireland, first in Belfast and then at a center that brought the province's Catholic and Protestant children together for time in the country. The Troubles had long historical roots, and even then in the early 80s, Catholics and Protestants had their own holidays, their own educational systems, their own neighborhoods. There were deep economic divides. When I was there, the adult Catholic male unemployment rate was 30%, triple that of Protestants. There were tanks and soldiers in the streets of Belfast during those years, and it was portrayed in the international media as a dangerous city under siege. Yet during my days there, it felt welcoming and village-like, and indeed, one of my colleagues confessed to me how they would never visit America, which, based on their television news, was a violent and scary place. My internal narrative of war deepened in trips to Vietnam and Cambodia, countries that were nightmarish memories for people I loved. Decades later, in villages and museums, I learned broader stories of what to the Vietnamese was the American War, spurred by the Vietnamese nationalization of their rubber industry. I learned about the ongoing impacts of Monsanto's Agent Orange, including the contamination of millions of acres of forest, soil, and water, and 150,000 people living with birth defects. And traveling through Cambodia's killing fields, it became clear that Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge and the genocide that killed 1/4 of their population was enabled by the destabilization of the country after being bombed by the United States. Times I spent in Asian Islamic countries, in India and China and Latin America, opened up a rich and complex story of history, culture, and peoples that continue to replace the cookie-cutter narratives of our media and deepened my understanding of our complicity in the woes of the planet. Coming back home from travels abroad, especially over the past few decades, as our ecological and human communities continue to be hollowed out, it seemed that we were all suffering from underlying stress and depression, a lack of meaning, and a concurrent addiction to violence. The family and village structures and people's ease in their own skin that seem to predominate in much of the world have somehow evaded us, perhaps rubbed out by our focus on individuals at the expense of the collective, and perhaps making true the African proverb, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." For Thomas Hubel and other therapists, we are all suffering from collective trauma as victims and perpetrators in the interdependent web of violence in which we've been raised. So, what are the markers of collective trauma of populations that have suffered persistent violence or repression? Shattered social fabric, loss of trust in institutions, crisis of meaning. Vicarious trauma, such as what we experience as observers of ICE activities or the using of food aid as a weapon of control, can also foster a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And even if violence stops, unaddressed collective trauma persists and accumulates and acts to inhibit our evolutionary potential, suppresses our development, and prevents us from realizing a new and better future. Yet to trauma therapists, grief, rage, and vulnerability are not detours. They can be doorways to understanding our societal shadows. The labor of collective healing is not self-indulgence, but structural intervention. It recognizes that generational trauma is too much for one individual nervous system to hold. What does generational healing look like? Deep listening, as both Jill's and Simo's and Mesa and Layla's story shows, and Natalie's. The practices of presence, transparent communication, honesty about the cost of war to people, places, and communities. It calls on holistic and creative expression, community and social support, collective healing spaces, and restorative practices. Peace building, likewise, is a set of processes that bridges deep divides in societies at the individual, collective, and community level, and invites the transformation of conflict without using violence. A peace process can provide spaces for individuals and collectives to bring their dreams and their gifts, giving space for new kinds of heroism. It's important to remember that perpetual war is not the only story that has been told about humanity. In The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wengrow challenged the idea that war has been universal in human history or inevitable. Rather, it's a product of specific historical and political choices and structures. It's not an unavoidable aspect of human nature or a necessary stage of social evolution. Peace activist Rian Eiler's book, The Chalice and the Blade, likewise relates that early societies were partnerships before a shift to dominator societies occurred around 5,000 years ago. This new story shows that a cooperative, nurturing, life-affirming future is possible, and that hierarchy, fear, and violence are not inevitable. A story of peace is not the absence of war, it's the presence of partnership. What does this new story look like, and how do we get there? Many of us remember Nelson Mandela's heroic engagement of all parties in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has served as a model in over 61 countries and regions. It's a chance for people to tell their stories, for all parties to recognize their complicity, and leads to calls to action for structural changes. In Northern Ireland, Truth and Reconciliation talks, integrated schooling, and investment in distressed communities has led to a long peace and the practice of democracy. In Sierra Leone, after the Civil War, the whole country engaged in a reconciliation process with peace councils at the village level, including opportunities for ceremony and envisioning their own development priorities. Hubel and others who are sharing the work of collective healing also put victims at the center, and note that hearing all voices, including through song, is an important part of the process. Peace negotiations often incorporate poets and musicians. They strive to answer the question, how do we find our way back to humanity? In Israel and Palestine, several organizations engage both separately and in joint peacekeeping building initiatives, including collective trauma healing, many under the umbrella of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. On an international level, a binding planetary peace treaty to end war was created at a gathering in Ireland in July 2025. The Club of Rome and the Global Academy of Arts and Sciences are also working on a global peace initiative. Even here in the United States, we are waking up. The collective learning we have done about racism and colonialism and the genocide of indigenous peoples helps us to make sense of this moment. And the devastation of Palestine and Ukraine are daily reminders of eras we do not want to repeat. One telling story is that it is harder and harder for the Army to recruit young people to fight, with the last few years the worst recruiting years in half a century. And of course, the peaceful demonstrations against authoritarianism and resistance to ICE show us that we are not alone in our distress. Yet, the current administration's undeclared wars, militaristic posturing, massing of troops in peaceful places, and proposals to resume nuclear testing are in some ways just an extreme and transparent version of our politics of might. War has been a project of both parties, and our $1 trillion yearly military budget has seen continual expansion, dwarfing the spending of all other countries and nearly double the combined expenditures of China, Russia, and India. Perhaps we can use this moment to realize more clearly the suffering we are inflicting out there and in here, and commit to a collective exploration of what a future without war, a future of partnership with our neighbors here and abroad, could mean for us and the planet. Thomas Hubel writes, "Our ancestors faced their own eras of profound disruption when the old ways no longer worked and new possibilities had not yet emerged. They learned that periods of breakdown can also be periods of breakthrough, that chaos carries within it the seeds of evolution. This is such a time. And in such times, the work of deepening our inner capacity is not a luxury, it's a necessity. The uncertainty we face requires us to expand our ability to be present with what we cannot control, to hold complexity without collapsing, and to remain resourced when the external world offers little stability. There's a clear place for Unitarian Universalist in this work. Bethany and I are just back from a UU educators retreat where we learned about the Canadian UU's role in the truth and reconciliation process being engaged with Indigenous peoples in Canada, work in which we are invited to share. Our practices of checking in and joys and sorrows, as Natalie so beautifully related, enable us to grieve and process and celebrate. Conversations like the ones during today's second hour with Laura and Rachel on how to navigate social media and disinformation, and next week's conversation on authoritarianism with Jack Dean, help us to keep collectively informed and give us skills to think about intersecting issues like money and technology and politics. And of course, parishioners are supporting our immigrant neighbors directly and through Vigils for Love. In the new year, we will be hosting a UU Common Read, Social Change Now, on how both adults and children can use their gifts as visionaries, storytellers, activists, and builders, not just to tell the truth about what we are seeing, but also to envision the new, and perhaps provide better pathways to heroism for our children and our children's children. May it be so.